So thank you all for coming. I see some familiar faces. I see some new faces. I will try not to disappoint. If you came to the first talk, the tone of this talk is going to be significantly different. I think that's appropriate for Veterans Day. The first talk, we talked about the USS Oklahoma from its conception as a modern battleship in the 19-teens until 1941, December 7th in the morning. Today we're going to start with December 7th. Now, the talk is called The Fall and the Rise because I do want to leave you today, hopefully with some examples of heroism and perhaps some, there's a lot of people who helped a lot of people, not only on this day, but in the decades since, and I hope to give you a sense of that. So that's all I'll say. Now, if you were at the first talk, we left off with this young man. This is Joe Lauder. Joe Lauder is from Oklahoma. He was a Marine bugler who was stationed on the USS Oklahoma. He was one of 2 buglers on the ship. His duty that Sunday morning, December 7th, was to play To the Colors. He was on the fantail of the battleship at about 7:50 a.m. doing his duty. Some time passes. He's getting ready to perform his bugle at 8 in the morning sharp. I almost said about, but that's not how this works with the Marines. 8 a.m. sharp, he was going to perform the bugle. And he saw some planes in the air. And he noticed that they weren't American planes. I owe a lot to Joe Todd, as with the first interview. Because of his hard work as an oral historian, we actually have a number of really great interviews with the sailors and the Marines that served on the USS Oklahoma. And Joe Lauder was one of the people who was interviewed by Joe Todd. And he talks about that moment when he saw the planes. He says, "I sounded first call and I looked up and I said to the corporal of the guard, 'Those are Japanese planes.' And the corporal of the guard said to me, 'Lauder, you are paid to blow, not think.' About that time, we got hit with the first torpedo. I never did sound To the Colors. The attack came 2 or 3 minutes before 8 a.m. I was supposed to sound general quarters with the bugle, but I told the boatswain's mate who blows the little whistle, and I told him to go ahead and tell them. He said," and this was, at the time, this is Ensign Rommel who came over the loudspeaker, general quarters, this is no bull," bad word. But Joe Lauder says, that probably saved more lives on the Oklahoma than anything, because you wouldn't dare say that unless you meant it. And indeed, he did mean it. Those were Japanese planes that had just launched from what was called the Kido Butai, or the Strike Force, which was 6 Japanese carriers. And they were attacking Pearl Harbor in force. About 400 planes, slightly less than 400 planes, were launched from those carriers. And they did a 2-wave coordinated attack on Pearl Harbor beginning slightly before 8 a.m. This photograph is actually taken by a Japanese pilot. The Japanese pilot, in addition to bringing torpedoes and bombs, also brought photographic equipment. They wanted to be sure that they could share the photographs with their superior officers who would want to know how successful the attack was. These photographs are now in the possession of the National Archives. And this was one photograph that was taken very early on in the attack by a Japanese pilot. This is Ford Island. This is an island that is in the middle of Pearl Harbor. So this is the larger harbor. There is an entrance to the harbor right here. And so right now we are looking actually to the southeast. So we're at the northwest of Ford Island, looking southeast. And you can see this line of planes here, or this line of battleships. But before I show you that, what's interesting about this photograph is you can actually see some of the Japanese planes in the air. These planes were likely, had just completed their attack run as torpedo planes, and were basically turning to the left, and they would probably do strafing runs and other things. But you can actually see planes in the frame. Now, this rather blurry close-up is what came to be known as Battleship Row. So this is part of Battleship Row to the south of Ford Island. This was a line of battleships leading up to Pearl Harbor. the United States had amassed its fleet in the Pacific, and indeed it had moved its fleet into a more forward position, meaning that it had moved it from the west coast of the United States to be stationed at Pearl Harbor because there was a fear of war with Japan. Not in this picture are two more battleships. They would be, I guess, over here. So the California and the Pennsylvania were a bit separated from the other battleships at the time, but they would also be attacked. So I think it's worthwhile to talk a little bit about the attack, just to set the scene and give you context for how not only surprising but chaotic the attack was, because this is going to become very important for the sailors and the Marines on the USS Oklahoma. So in the back of Battleship Row is the USS Nevada. The USS Nevada was the only one of these battleships that was able to get underway at the time of the attack. In fact, the USS Nevada was able to make its way through the channel. However, it was taking on water, and so the captain made a decision to actually beach the battleship, basically run it aground, for fear that if it sank in the channel, it would basically trap all of the ships in the channel and they wouldn't be able to escape. And so he made a decision to actually beach the Nevada. This is the USS Arizona. It's the only battleship that's still at Pearl Harbor. If you have been to Pearl Harbor, you've no doubt seen the USS Arizona Memorial. We'll talk a bit about the USS Arizona. On the port side of the ship, you can actually make out a smaller vessel. This is not a battleship, this is the USS Vestal. This was a repair ship that happened to be moored alongside Arizona at the time. Next in line, we have the West Virginia and the Tennessee. The Tennessee would actually be relatively undamaged, relatively speaking, during the attack, and a few months later it would actually be serving in the Pacific in a combat capacity. To its port is the USS West Virginia, and in front of them, the USS Maryland, and then the USS Oklahoma. So the USS Oklahoma is not in a great position during this attack. And one of the reasons, if you remember, the entrance to the channel is coming in this direction, and many of the torpedo planes are coming down the channel to make their attack runs. And so when they come down the channel, right off to their right, one of the first battleships they see is the USS Oklahoma. So it is a prime target, and it's one of the first ships that's going to be attacked on December 7th. So Joe Todd was interviewing Adolph Mortensen, and he talks about his experience that day. He says, "I had just stepped into the JO mess," this is the junior officer mess, "right next to the #1 turret when the first explosion hit. I couldn't believe it, but it lifted the ship, which weighed 29,000 tons, about the height of the table. And it just was a big whoom. It slowly sank down, and that was the only explosion I remember. But I know there were others. So many of the people on the ship had no idea they were under attack until that general quarters was sounded, and the attack came almost immediately after. So they had no time to get to general quarters, which is where they would have been stationed during an attack. Now, the USS Oklahoma would not only be attacked first, but it would receive at least 5 torpedo hits, all on the same side. And this would prove to be a devastating attack. This is actually an aerial photograph taken by another Japanese pilot. It's a little difficult to see. However, we have the USS Oklahoma, right, the top right of this photograph, and you'll notice there is this discoloration in the water. This is fuel oil that's leaking from the USS West Virginia and the USS Oklahoma. So along the sides of the hull, there were these huge tanks of fuel oil, and these were punctured by the torpedoes. And so this fuel oil is leaking into Pearl Harbor. This becomes important later because this fuel oil will ignite as many people are trying to escape. Jim Stallings was in the #4 turret during much of the attack, and he told Bill Pitts in an interview, "The second torpedo knocked out the lights. Then the emergency lights came on, and the third and the fourth torpedo knocked those out. And so we were in total darkness in the handling room." The handling room is at the bottom of the ship. So in essence, Jim Stallings is about 4 stories below deck, and all the lights are out. So the second torpedo would take out the lights. The emergency lights came on, but by the third and fourth torpedo, they were off. So the sailors and Marines who were inside the ship, and most of them were at the time, they were in complete darkness. Unless they had a porthole or they had some access to sunlight, particularly at the bottom of the ship, and particularly in the turrets, which don't have access to sunlight. You want to keep those armored and closed. They found themselves in complete darkness. The only light that they had was the occasional flashlight or pin light that they might have with them. So here we have the USS Oklahoma. The captain of the ship, Captain Bode, happened to not be on the ship that morning. And in fact, that morning was a bit unusual for a few reasons. Not only was the captain not on the ship, so the executive officer was in command, but they were ready for admiral's inspection. What that meant was a lot of the watertight doors that would normally be closed to prevent flooding were open because they were prepared for admiral's inspection the next day. I believe Ed Vesey, who also was an ensign on the ship, we'll talk about him later, I believe he said that they had actually stowed all of the anti-air ammunition below deck as part of this inspection. So even if you went above deck to try to fight back, you had guns but no ammo. Not a great situation. Those doors being open would prove fatal for the ship that day. They couldn't control the flooding. It happened very, very quickly. Joe Lauder would say, Commander Kenworthy, this is the executive officer was in charge of the ship. I found him and he was walking up and down the deck and she was starting to list. That is to say, starting to tilt to port. All the water was rushing in on the port side. So if you think about it, you're in the ship and all of a sudden you can start to feel the ship move. If you read the interviews, many of the people didn't realize the ship was listing because when you're in complete darkness, you don't have any visual frames of reference. And so at first they didn't know that the ship was listing until it was listing very severely. She was starting to list. I said to him, quote, "We better get off this thing." He said, "You're right, bugler. Pass the word to abandon ship." That's when we abandoned ship. I went over the side and took off my clothes, except for my skivvies. I took the bugle and I threw it as far as I could into the water. Then I slid into the water and started swimming to the Maryland. Many of the sailors who were exiting the vessel on this side of the ship were swimming to the Maryland to try to board the Maryland. The Maryland was relatively protected from the torpedo attacks because the only way to attack the Maryland was to go through the USS Oklahoma. And the USS Oklahoma was taking a pounding from these torpedoes, one after another. This is an illustration of what happened to the ship. And although you can't see it down here, this is the timing of the list. The ship was upright at about 8 a.m. By 8:09, it was flipped over and underwater. So the men in the ship had minutes. So if you think 10 minutes from the first torpedo to the ship capsizing, they had 600 seconds to react. Most of them were in total darkness. And so there was very little in some cases that they could do. Ed Vesey told Joe Todd in an interview, this one's at the Eisenhower Presidential Library, quote, "We were still in our pajamas." He's talking about him and his roommate. "And the famous call from Ensign Rommel came over the loudspeaker with his profanity and realized this was no drill. I very carefully opened the safe and got my .45 out." This is his .45 sidearm, so it's a gun. "And my new cap, which I had just bought." Okay, what else is he wearing, you wonder? "I went to my general quarters with my pajamas, my moccasins on, and with my .45 pistol and my new hat." They had no time to react. General quarters was sounded. This is 8 a.m. Many of them jumped out and essentially ran to their stations wearing whatever they were wearing at the time. Ed Vesey was an ensign at the time, and he was wearing pajamas and moccasins. He goes on, "My general quarters was halfway up the foremast." So if you remember from the last talk, there are two large masts on the Oklahoma. The one on the front of the ship, his position was halfway up as an anti-aircraft officer. So he was one of the officers in charge of the response if there was an air attack. You can imagine he was hurrying to his station. I was in a gunnery division, and as far as I know, I was the only anti-aircraft officer on board. I had to literally fight my way topside because everyone was heading below deck. Now, why were people heading below deck? Well, there's a reason for this. If you're under air attack, the enemy is going to drop bombs on the armored deck. They're going to strafe the deck with machine guns. The safest place to be is below deck. The problem is, in this case, all of these men were rushing to their stations below deck, and then the lights went out, and the ship started to capsize. So they would have been safer on the deck, but their general quarters were inside of the battleship. Stephen Bowen Young was one of the people who was stationed deep inside of the ship. He actually wrote a book later, and he says in that book, those of us who were left behind in the powder handling room, this is the bottom of the ship, during those final seconds when the ship capsized, were not aware at first that she was turning turtle. The darkness there was wild and confusing, with objects of all descriptions being tumbled and thrown around. Many of them almost describe it as if they were in a tumble dryer. All of a sudden, the room around them started to turn, and suddenly they are standing on the wall and then on the ceiling. As we frantically fought to save ourselves, we became disoriented. It all happened so quickly that we could hardly grasp what was going on. These handling rooms were particularly dangerous because the 5-inch shells and the 14-inch shells that were fired from the main guns were essentially on shelves. They were held in place by a chain or a rope. Well, as the ship capsized, all of these heavy shells began to tumble off the shelves and onto some of the men who were in there. So many of the men were severely injured, and this would have prevented their escape. So this is the final photograph I have from a Japanese pilot. This is probably 15 minutes into the attack. You can see we have the Nevada in the back. The Arizona is obscured, and you can see actually this is the Arizona. You'll notice the Oklahoma. The Oklahoma is no longer in line with the other battleships now. The reason is because this is the superstructure of the ship. So this photograph is taken as she's rolling over. So at this point, she has a 90-degree list, which means it's basically horizontal. Now, the USS Oklahoma wasn't the only ship under attack. All of the ships under attack. The initial attack were torpedo planes that were dropping torpedoes and hitting many of the ships that were on the port side. They would later drop bombs on all of these vessels. The Arizona in particular was hit by a bomb. It penetrated the magazine, and there was a magazine explosion. This destroyed the ship, and it would kill over 1,000 people, I believe. And it is still there in Pearl Harbor. It is a war memorial, and you can go there. And indeed, I believe to this day, the USS Arizona is still leaking small amounts of fuel oil, which they were not able to extract from the ship. Joe Lauder says, "While I was in the water, the Arizona blew up. Everything was flying in the air, and the water was on fire. All of that fuel oil that's in the water, because of the attack, suddenly lights on fire. So all of these men are trying to escape their sinking ship, and suddenly the water around them just kind of ignites." Chester Jankowski told Joe Todd, quote, "It started raining steel and stuff after the explosion. You could hardly see because of all the smoke and fire. There was so much oil on the water, and they were trying to pick up people with boats, and the oil was on fire." So there were people who were in small craft, and despite the fires, they were desperately trying to get as many people out of the water as possible. And they were endangering themselves in the process. Now, there were a number of people who distinguished themselves that day. I'm going to highlight a few of them. You are looking at, this is Seaman Ward, and this is Ensign Flaherty. I believe Flaherty was in turret 1, and I believe Seaman Ward was in turret 2. When the lights went out in the turret, there was no way to see. Flaherty and Ward had flashlights. As the ship started to roll over, They stayed in the turret with their flashlights, shining it on the door as it was essentially turning around them. I heard one person, Joe Todd, speculated that they may have been trying to hold the door open because the door would have potentially closed shut as the ship rolled, and so they were potentially holding the door open. But in those last moments, not much is known because they stayed in the turret until the last. They never made it out. They were desperately trying to save all the other people in the turret, and they would later be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for their sacrifice. This is Chaplain Schmidt. Chaplain Schmidt, or Aloysius, I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly, was a lieutenant on the USS Oklahoma and a chaplain. Lieutenant Schmidt was an ordained Catholic priest, so he did Mass on the ship. He had a chalice. So, he had a chalice on the ship. He would perform Mass for the Catholics that were on the vessel. And he was well liked by many members of the crew. His sacrifice would also be remembered. Bob Burns was interviewed by Joe Todd, and Bob Burns was one of the last people to interact with Lieutenant Schmidt. He said, "I had worked from the 7th to the 3rd deck, working the way up the ship. When I got there, Chaplain Schmidt, one of the finest men I had ever met, gave his life for us. He hollered, 'Over here.' There were 2 guys on the outside pulling guys out, and he was pushing them through. Then I got he said, 'Burns, we're going to get you out of here.' The chaplain told me to just stick one arm through, then I got the other through. But my hips stuck. The chaplain pushed and they pulled, and I was bleeding all around the waist when they pulled me through." Now, they tried to save Chaplain Schmidt, but the portholes were 12 or 14 inches wide. So some men couldn't fit through the portholes. And initially, they tried to pull Schmidt through the portholes, and they were having trouble like Burns. So W.A. Parrott, an electrician's mate, first clap on the ship, I'm reading from a Des Moines Register article here, later penned a letter to the Navy Chaplain Corps testifying about Schmidt's heroism. Quote, he said, they're trying to get Schmidt out, "Boys, I'm having a tough time getting through," Parrott's letter read. "So we all got together and tried to pull him out, but no luck." His next words really took us by surprise and will linger with us for some time. He said, "Men, you are endangering your lives and you're keeping others from getting through." That's when Schmidt disappeared back into the ship, knowing well he would never come out alive. So he basically got out of the porthole and just tried to save as many people as he could. That's from a Kelly McGowan article in the Des Moines Register. Eventually, Chaplain Schmidt would receive the Silver Star for his heroism that day. Now, there was utter chaos. I could give many examples of this. I'll actually give an example from the perspective of the Maryland. This is an order that was written by hand on the Maryland. And it says, "Maryland ready, proceed, but unable, get clear." Essentially, the Maryland was trying to get underway. They were trying to light the boilers. They were trying to get moving. They wanted to get clear. It's safer if you're moving, because then you're a moving target. But they couldn't. And you can see down here, it says, "Note, Okla capsized, alongside, reason for above." As the USS Oklahoma began to list, the Maryland was tied to the Oklahoma. And at some point, they had to make the decision to cut the Oklahoma loose. So the men on the Maryland, during the attack, witnessed as their comrades in the ship next to them, their ship just went over. So I'm going to show you some videos from the attack itself. So I didn't have many videos in the first talk because it was the teens and the 20s. Now we're into the 40s, so we actually do have some videos that we can see. You may have seen some of this footage before. This is from a newsreel compilation. This is the highest quality I could find. And I'll just sort of talk through the things that you're witnessing. So this is the USS Arizona. This is when the magazine exploded. This would destroy the ship. The Arizona would burn for days afterward. It would be smoldering and burning. So you can see the massive conflagration. That's the Arizona. She basically sank where she was, and there she remains. You can see all of the oil on fire. I believe this is the West Virginia. The West Virginia sank, but luckily for some of the crew, sank straight down. So rather than rolling over, it actually sank to the mud on the bottom, so its superstructure was still above the water. This is more footage of the USS Arizona burning. So this is Battleship Row, and you can barely make out the USS Oklahoma. So here's the USS Maryland, and the Oklahoma has capsized to port. You can see the massive fires all around the ships. Men were jumping into the water to try to escape. There's the hull of the Oklahoma, and just fires everywhere. The shortest distance to swim was Ford Island, but you can see just the massive fires. Many people actually swam the channel to the other side. This is more footage of the West Virginia. You can see these men desperately trying to put out fires on the neighboring ship. We'll talk about some of the men in these boats later. But here we have the USS Oklahoma. Pretty much, I don't exactly know when this was taken, but I imagine this is within the first day of the attack, given the smoke and the flames. And you can see that there are men standing on the hull. We'll talk about some of these men in a moment. So the Oklahoma, this is the fall of the USS Oklahoma. She was in Pearl Harbor that day, and she was hit by numerous torpedoes. She capsized. However, there were still many crew alive within the ship. So you can imagine, if you've done this before, right? You take a cup, you put it in the water, right? The water doesn't fill up the cup. And the reason is because the air pressure basically eventually pushes back on the water, and there are going to be these pockets of air in the ship. Everyone knew that this was the case. They knew that there were people alive in the ship. In fact, there were dozens of men who were still alive at the time. And immediately after, people tried to save them. And some of them were from neighboring ships. Some of them were Oklahoma crewmates. Some of them were civilians, as we'll talk about. So Stephen Bowen Young, from his book, and I'll tell you the title of the book now. It's called Trapped at Pearl Harbor, Escape from Battleship Oklahoma. So if you remember, he's at the bottom of turret 4, and the ship rolls over. He's at the bottom of the ship. The ship turns upside down, almost upside down. Now he's at the top of the ship. So his basically world is inverted 180 degrees. And he talks about it in his book. He says, quote, 2 or 3 sailors decided they would see if the ship's lucky bag, which led off the trunk, would offer a better place for the 11 of us to stay. So it was him and 10 others. The water was continuing to rise in the trunk and was coming up over the lower rungs of the ladder on which some of us sat. Leaving our precarious perch on the steel platform, Hinsperger and I, along with the other 9, who had been sitting or stretched out on the ladder below us, entered the lucky bag. The lucky bag was a compartment near the rear of the ship, towards the bottom of the ship. It's where they stored mattresses for the bunks. So essentially, think of it as a big closet. It was full of coats and mattresses. But when they went inside, they noticed it was dry. So they went inside this compartment and they tried to seal the door as well as they could to try to conserve oxygen and prevent the compartment from flooding. They had no idea whether or not they could even be rescued at this point. Because again, the ship is inverted. So they're standing on the ceiling, and the floor is now the ceiling. So you can imagine they're terrified. So, the rescues. This was a dangerous situation. Despite that, almost immediately people began to devise ways to try to get people out of the ship. They knew that there were people alive in the ship and that they would be in pockets in these compartments. How do you get them out? Their first plan was, we're going to get some torches, we're going to cut them out. We're going to cut holes in the hull, and we're going to try to get to as many compartments as we can. And so that's what they started to do. There was a problem. First of all, as I said, the exterior of the ship had huge tanks of fuel oil. You don't want to hit a huge tank of fuel oil with a torch. So you have to cut in the right place. How do you know where to cut? So the first thing they had to do was they had to go get plans for the ship, so they would know where to cut. If you cut into, say, a tank of water, no problem, right? So they had to know where they could cut into the hull. Luckily for them, the only silver lining was the ship was capsized almost upside down. The bottom of the ship was underneath the armor belt, which meant that the steel was actually relatively thin compared to, say, the upper parts of the ship. So they could conceivably get through the steel. So they got torches and they got to work. But they encountered another problem. They started to cut into compartments, and they realized that the insulation in the compartments was cork. So when they were torching through the compartments that they were torching into would fill with smoke. And so this was very dangerous, not only for the people with the torches, but for the men inside. And indeed, at least 2 sailors would suffocate in these early attempts, because as they were cutting through, this cork was burning and the oil-based paint on the side of the wall was burning. And so they gave up. But they didn't give up. This is when Shop 11 from the Naval Yard showed up. These were civilians. These were carpenters, these were fitters, these were welders. These were people who basically worked in the Naval Yard, doing repairs, renovating the inside of ships. They worked in dry dock, for example. 2 of these men were Julio de Castro and Joe Bulgo. They were civilians. They showed up with a barge, and they had a plan. If we can't cut them out, we will bash them out. So they came with everything that could cut without fire, drills. They came with pneumatic hammers with chisels on the end that were sharp enough to cut. They came with sledgehammers. They came with everything. Their plan was, we will cut the ship open like a tin can. That's how we'll get them out. And they set to work. I think by midnight that night. They had all the equipment ready. They came up with a barge, and they started work. To give you a sense of how soon after the attack is, in the Smithsonian Magazine, in an article by David Kindy, De Castro is quoted from a story in the 1942 Honolulu Star Bulletin. He said, "The Arizona was still burning. It threw light on us as we worked." So they could work basically by the light of the Arizona burning. Over the next 8 hours, they did everything they can to cut people out of the ship in the stern. You can see, this is soon after the attack, people are already on the ship, and they're already trying to get into the ship. One of the things they would do is they would take a drill, they would drill a hole into the hull, and then they would try to cut it open, right? Cut a hole open large enough so that men could get in and out. They could get men down to continue cutting through compartments. They could get men out once they reached them. But there were more problems. One problem was that, as I said before, one of the things that was keeping those compartments relatively dry was the incredible air pressure in those compartments. The air was pressing against the water and preventing it to rise. The problem is, as soon as you puncture the hull, you release that air pressure, and the water starts to rise. So they talk about how they would drill into a compartment, and the men inside would hear this deafening hiss. It would just be this whoosh of air as air was escaping the hole, and all of a sudden the water would start to rise around them. So as soon as they drill into a compartment, they're racing against time. And so they raced against time for the next 8 hours. They cut into a compartment called Radio 4. Here's how they got there. So this is, I can't remember, I think this is the first platform. So this is there's the handling room, right, that we were talking about earlier, right? Right off here is the lucky bag. So it says lucky bag, Department D57. Right off of that was the emergency radio room. And here was a void, and then here was a fresh water tank. So they knew they could get through. We can get through this part of the ship because it's fresh water. So they drilled into that compartment. There's a problem. There's 12,000 gallons of water in that compartment. So the first thing they have to do is they have to pump a huge think swimming pool, absolutely dry so they can work. So they drill into the ship, they start pumping out water. They pump out water. They drill into this void area. They're in this void area. And guess what they hear on the other side of this wall? They hear men knocking. So they know that they're at a compartment. So they cut into radio 4. They get, I think, 6 men out of this particular room, and one of the men, as he's leaving, says, there's more men on the other side of this wall. He's talking about the lucky bag. So Stephen Bowen Young and 10 other people are on that other side of the wall. Now, they knew that this was dangerous because when they cut into radio room 4, the water started to rise. So not only was it a race against time to get the 6 men of radio 4 out, they had to get the men of the lucky bag out before the water rose as well. And so they got to work. Stephen Bowen Young, in Trapped at Pearl Harbor, says, quote, Julio de Castro, who was talking to us from the next compartment, helped us almost as much by his calm and reassuring manner as he did with that pneumatic hammer. Right now, the difference between life and death was to get that piece of steel bent back so that we could get out. The sledgehammer rang against the metal. The 3-sided piece of steel bent a little, again and again. Gradually, the steel was pushed back. The opening widened as the water pushed at us from behind. So basically, they're opening a hole. What they did was they cut the first 3 sides of a square, and they realized we don't have time to finish the square because the water is rising behind the men. So they just got anything they could, and they started to bash that flap down. They literally opened that compartment like a tin can. Quote, the opening widened as the water pushed us from behind. Now the hold was open, just wide enough for us to scrape through. It was just in time. The water was up to our chests and shoulders, flooding faster and faster into the lucky bag. So they managed to escape, but the water was right behind them. At this time, they had to retreat because the water had filled these compartments. So they had to come back up and they had to start over. So this is one example of what civilians and crew were doing. They were desperately trying to cut into the ship at various parts. Any place that they could cut into the ship without hitting something that would potentially light on fire, they were trying to cut into it. Walter Staff was interviewed by the U.S. National Park Service, and this is included in Joe Todd's book. He says, you have no idea of time, but it must have been early Tuesday morning or late Monday night. And we heard some tapping. We heard some tapping. That gave us new life. But I didn't have anything to tap with, so we had to scrounge around. I found a little open-ended wrench. Neither of us knew the code. They didn't know Morse code. We weren't signalmen. They were working their way to try to get us out. So they were in a different part of the ship. I believe Walter Staff was one of the last 2 people that they actually managed to extract from the ship. But over the course of 2 days, they managed to get some people out of the ship. So Walter Staff was asked, what was it like coming out of the ship? And Walter said, it's like being born again. It was really great. We had given up before we even tapped. And then when there was a little more hope, like I said, when we came out and saw the whole fleet on the bottom, that was terrible. We had no idea. They had announced a Japanese air attack. I was below deck during the whole thing. So even when they came out, there was this elation, and then they looked around, and they couldn't believe what they saw. The fleet was largely sunk. The battleship fleet, I should say. In all, they managed to save 32 men from the ship by cutting them out. This is an aerial photograph from much later. You can see the oil just streaking away from these battleships, and you can see the hull of the USS Oklahoma here. Now, what do you do with the USS Oklahoma at this point? So here's the Arizona. The Arizona has sunk in place, but the USS Oklahoma is actually fallen into the channel. So in some ways, it's a navigational hazard because it's blocking part of the channel. So it is decided that they need to recover the ship. They need to find a way to refloat the ship and get it out of the harbor. So what do? Well, they decide we're going to tie cables to the ship on these giant, they're A-frames basically. We're going to weld those to the side of the ship to get leverage. We're going to put cables on the top of those. We're going to try to refloat the boat as much as we can, get it as buoyant as possible, and then we're going to slowly roll the ship back over. And so that's what they set about doing. The first thing they needed to do was they needed to pump out all of the fuel oil. Because again, there was all this flammable fuel oil still in the ship. They needed to get rid of it so that they could work. What I'm about to show you is the US Navy actually documented this process incredibly well. We actually have video of this process. So these are salvage workers on the ship. And you can barely see here, but we're about to get a close-up. They have these pumps on the ship, and the pumps are just going nonstop. They're pumping out fuel water, they're pumping out water. They have to get as much of this out of the ship as they can. They get access to the ship through these tiny square holes. It allows them to go into the ship, but it's dangerous in the ship. Imagine that you're in a ship, partially submerged, full of fuel oil fumes. You can't go down there. So what do? Well, you wear respirators, relatively primitive respirators. So you can see here one of the men entering that hole. Here's his flashlight. Here's his tube that he uses to get air to the respirator. He also has a tiny tank with him in case that gets severed, because there's sharp metal all along the edges of the ship. He has emergency air that he can plug into to try to get out. Men did this day after day after day to recover the ship. Here's another picture of some of the men who would salvage the ship. Now, I don't want to get too graphic, but think of all of the things inside of that ship. You have wood, you have food that is spoiled, and for the last year, in the Hawaiian heat, has been basically mixing with all of this seawater. You also have the remains of individuals who were on the ship. That was all inside of the ship, and they went into the ship day after day after day, and they tried to, basically, they couldn't patch the ship initially, but what they did was they created what they called a bubble, enough air to create buoyancy so that they could turn the ship over so that they could work on the ship properly. You can see here the giant cables they use. So this is Ford Island. So now, before when we looked at Ford Island, we were over here looking to the southeast. Now we're essentially at the east looking west. So they anchored these cables on Ford Island, and they slowly, I think it was 1.5 degrees a day, they slowly just pulled the ship up, just a little bit at a time. So throughout 1942, they were going into the ship to try to make it buoyant enough so that they could turn it. In 1943, they started to turn the ship. So over the course of 2 years, they're salvaging the ship. As they were turning the ship over, they began to see the damage to the ship. The superstructure was bent. I've tried to think of an analogy, but I can't. This is all steel, but when it rolled over and all those thousands of tons of ship were pushing it into the mud, the superstructure of the ship just crumpled up like paper almost. So when they were pulling this ship upright, all of this became exposed. This is November 3rd, 1943. This was actually a big day in the USS Oklahoma's history. It was on this day that they refloated the ship. So by November, so less than 2 years after it capsized, they were able to float the ship, and within, I think, 2 months, December 1943, the ship had power and was able to get into dry dock. Once in dry dock, they were able to see the damage that was done to the ship. They were able to see where the torpedoes had hit the ship and the devastation that had been wrought. But of course, even though they've refloated the ship, the salvage efforts are not over. For example, you have personal effects, you have shells, you have ammunition, you have gunpowder, you have fuel oil, all are in this ship. People have to go into this ship and they have to remove all of these things, right? As they're doing this, they're also coming across the remains of sailors and Marines. And so they're trying to be as respectful as possible so that hopefully they can be identified later. Now, I'm not going to end the talk here because there's a little bit more to say. But here's what happens to the USS Oklahoma. It goes through more recovery efforts where they recover personal effects, remains, all of these things from the ship, and then they auction the ship. They're going to send it to the breakers. On the way to the mainland US, the ship sinks. So they're actually towing it away from Hawaii. And I can't remember what book I read this in, but there was this great quote where they said, "She chose the sea." It was this idea that like she chose where she was going to sink. So that's pretty stubborn, and I appreciate it. That's the only levity I can give you, though. I'm sorry. In all, 429 people died on the ship. In particular, there were 13 pairs of brothers on that ship. And there was actually a set of 3 brothers, all of whom were killed on the ship. I have 2 boys, so that one's tough. So there were lots of people who survived the ship, however, and they wanted to keep the memories of those friends that they had lost alive, and they wanted to reconnect. And they did. Periodically, the USS Oklahoma crew would get together for reunions. Indeed, those reunions were where Joe Todd interviewed the members of the crew. So it's largely thanks to them that we have their stories, because they would get together and they would share their stories about what happened that day and their time on the ship. However, there was another group of people who wanted to help those 429 sailors and Marines, and that was the DPAA. The DPAA is the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. They're in charge of trying to identify any unknown remains of individuals who have lost their lives in military service. And so this is from their website. Quote, they wanted to identify the remains. Here's how hard this process was. This process began in 2003 with the disinterment of a single casket of unknown USS Oklahoma remains, thought to contain the commingled remains of 5 individuals. Upon analysis by the DPAA laboratory, this casket was determined to have contained partial remains of nearly 100 individuals, revealing the breadth of research and scientific work necessary to fully account for the Oklahoma's missing sailors and Marines. So they wanted to send these sailors and Marines home. They wanted them to be identified so that they could be buried next to their parents, next to their loved ones. And so what they did was, I believe in 2005, they requested DNA samples from survivors and their families because they wanted to do DNA testing on the remains to try to identify the remains and send them home to those families. They had 394 individuals of the 429 that were unidentified. When they ended their work, they had identified all but 32 of them. So they managed to identify over 90% of the unknown sailors who had been recovered. In fact, several of the people that I talked about earlier were recovered. In fact, the 3 sailors that I talked about who had lost their lives and been awarded the Silver Star and the Congressional Medal of Honor, they would eventually be recovered and they would eventually be identified. In fact, in 2016, the DPAA announced that they had identified the remains of Chaplain Schmidt. Chaplain Schmidt, once he was identified, he was taken back to Iowa, where he now rests at Loras College, which is his alma mater. In fact, if you go to Loras College, you will see a chapel there that was dedicated to Schmidt and where he is buried. And indeed, the personal effects that they recovered from the ship that were his are also there at Loras College, including the chalice that I talked about earlier. Indeed, the funeral mass in 2016, I believe it was 2016, The funeral mass at the chapel for Chaplain Schmidt, they used his chalice in the mass. Ensign Flaherty, one of the people who had stayed in the turret and shined the light on that door to let others escape, it was announced in September 10th, 2020, that he had been identified, and he went back to Michigan in 2021. And finally, last year, in July of 2023, they were able to identify the last of these remains. But by this time, it wasn't just the remains that they were returning. There was lots of interest to set up a USS Oklahoma memorial. And so in the early 2000s, they managed to secure funding for this memorial. And this is actually the dedication service. Ed Veazey, who was an ensign on the Oklahoma, who had run above decks wearing nothing but his pajamas, his moccasin, his .45, and his new cap, gave the keynote address. And he gave the keynote address to these gentlemen here, who are survivors of the USS Oklahoma. So they were able to be there to dedicate that memorial. And Seaman Ward was able to go home as well. In 2023, his remains were identified, and in December of last year, he was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. I'd love to leave you with a positive note. Hopefully these stories of heroism and bravery are enough, but if not, the USS Oklahoma is returning. So the USS Oklahoma name has remained dormant for, since 1941, right? However, there's going to be a new USS Oklahoma. It was announced recently that a Virginia-class attack submarine would carry the name USS Oklahoma. And indeed, this is the keel inspection ceremony. This is Mary Slavonic, who has Oklahoma ties, has ties to Oklahoma State University. She is sponsoring the ship. So the USS Oklahoma will soon be on the register, the rolls of the Navy, in honor of those sailors who served on it and who passed away. And hopefully someday, those few that remain, they'll be able to return home as well. Thank you.